History is rarely a straight line. It twists, turns, and hides its most profound lessons beneath the surface of what is recorded. The story of a people daring to imagine a different future, of ordinary individuals challenging extraordinary power, is both timeless and deeply human. It begins with whispers of discontent and grows into the thunderous calls for freedom that echo across centuries. Imagine a time when a vast continent, rich in resources and ripe with potential, bristled under the strict control of a distant monarchy. The air was thick with tension, every interaction, every law, every tax carrying the weight of unseen injustice. Within these tensions, the seeds of revolution were sown. Hello and welcome to the Other Side Stories. Here, we travel beyond the usual headlines to explore the untold tales of world history, mysteries, turning points, and hidden connections that shaped our planet. If you love discovering how the past still echoes in our present, you're in the right place. Let's uncover the other side of history together. The American Revolution was not an event that happened overnight. It was the product of decades of accumulation, of grievances, of philosophical debates, and of cultural shifts that made the colonists increasingly aware of their own identity apart from the British crown. At the heart of the matter was a question as fundamental as it was dangerous: who gets to govern, and on what grounds? For the 13 colonies that stretched along the eastern seaboard of North America, this question would soon demand an answer in the most dramatic of ways. Life in the colonies had always been a mixture of opportunity and constraint. While the vast Atlantic separated them from London, the reach of the British government was never entirely absent. Trade regulations, taxes, and laws were enforced, often in ways that seemed arbitrary or exploitative to settlers who had grown accustomed to a degree of autonomy. The Navigation Acts, for instance, dictated not only what goods could be shipped, but also through which ports, and imposed strict controls on commerce. To the British government, these measures were practical and necessary for maintaining empire. To the colonists, they became symbols of oppression. The mid-18th century saw these tensions escalate. The aftermath of the 7 Years' War, or as it was known in the colonies, the French and Indian War, left Britain with a massive debt. The solution, from the perspective of London, was simple: tax the very colonies that had benefited from British military protection. But what seemed simple to policymakers across the ocean sparked outrage thousands of miles away. The Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765 were early catalysts. They were not simply about raising revenue. They struck at the very notion of colonial self-determination. No longer could colonists assume that local assemblies had ultimate authority over their own affairs. Protests arose in the streets and in print. Merchants boycotted British goods. Pamphlets circulated, arguing not just against taxation, but for the philosophical principles that underpinned self-governance. It was a period when ideas mattered as much as muskets, when words had the power to inspire acts of extraordinary courage. Figures such as Samuel Adams and John Dickinson penned treatises that questioned the legitimacy of parliamentary authority over distant lands, invoking rights that were both natural and inherent. These writings were more than political arguments. They were the blueprints for a new vision of society, one in which power derived not from birthright, but from the consent of the governed. The colonies, however, were far from uniform in their response. In New England, particularly in Massachusetts, resistance was fervent and often dramatic. The Boston Massacre of 1770, though small in scale, became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked authority and of the willingness of the British military to suppress dissent violently. Propaganda, carefully crafted and widely disseminated, transformed the deaths of a few into a rallying cry for liberty. Meanwhile, in the South and the Middle colonies, responses were more measured, reflecting the complex interplay of economic interests, social hierarchies, and local politics. Yet the undercurrent of dissatisfaction was everywhere, and slowly, imperceptibly at first, it began to coalesce into the notion that compromise with Britain might no longer be possible. One of the pivotal moments that heightened tensions was the Tea Act of 1773, which granted the British East India Company the right to sell tea directly to the colonies, effectively undercutting local merchants. The response was theatrical, audacious, and unmistakably rebellious: the Boston Tea Party. Disguised as Mohawk Indians, colonists boarded British ships and dumped hundreds of chests of tea into Boston Harbor. It was a calculated act of defiance, symbolic and strategic, signaling that ordinary men were willing to challenge imperial power openly and risk severe consequences. Britain's reaction, the Coercive Acts of 1774, aims to punish Massachusetts and reassert authority, but instead it galvanized the colonies. The idea that one colony could be punished for defiance alarmed others, prompting a sense of shared fate and collective identity. In response, the First Continental Congress convened in 1774. Delegates from 12 colonies, Georgia would join later, gathered to articulate a unified response. They did not yet call for independence, but they demanded rights and representation, setting the stage for a confrontation that would ultimately redefine governance, society, and human rights in the New World. The Congress adopted resolutions that condemned the coercive acts, endorsed boycotts of British goods, and affirmed the right of colonies to self-tax. These were the early gestures of unity, tentative and cautious, yet laying the foundation for revolutionary action. As 1775 dawned, armed conflict became increasingly inevitable. The skirmishes at Lexington and Concord in April of that year marked the beginning of open warfare. Minutemen and colonial militias faced off against British troops in battles that in scale were modest, but in significance they were monumental. The shots fired in those small towns reverberated across the Atlantic, signaling that negotiation alone could no longer resolve the impasse. Suddenly, the question of rights and governance transformed from philosophical debate to a matter of life and death. The formation of the Continental Army under the leadership of George Washington was another critical development. Washington's appointment was both practical and symbolic. He brought military experience and a presence that could unify disparate colonial militias into a coherent fighting force. Yet the army faced enormous challenges: shortages of supplies, inexperienced troops, harsh winters, and the daunting task of confronting the best-trained military in the world. Every victory, no matter how small, required immense ingenuity, resilience, and sacrifice. Throughout the early years of the Revolution, battles ebbed and flowed, with victories and setbacks shaping both morale and strategy. The Battle of Bunker Hill, although technically a British victory, demonstrated that colonial forces could stand against professional soldiers. The Siege of Boston, the campaign in New York, and the protracted struggle in New Jersey revealed the complexities of 18th century warfare and the extraordinary resilience of the revolutionaries. It was a war fought not only on battlefields, but in homes, taverns, and print shops, where ideas, alliances, and propaganda shaped the contours of rebellion as decisively as muskets and cannons. Amidst the fighting, the revolutionary cause began to take on philosophical depth. Thinkers and leaders increasingly embraced Enlightenment ideas, articulating principles of liberty, equality, and governance that transcended local grievances. Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, published in January 1776, captured the imagination of colonists across social strata. Paine's arguments were radical yet accessible, making the case that independence was not just desirable, but inevitable. He framed the conflict in terms of natural rights and human dignity, transforming a political struggle into a moral imperative. These ideas culminated in the Declaration of Independence, adopted on July 4, 1776. The document was more than a statement of separation. It was a manifesto of ideals, asserting that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that when those powers are abused, people have the right to alter or abolish them. Its language was deliberate and eloquent, articulating grievances against King George III while laying out a vision for a society built on principles rather than imposed authority. The Declaration was revolutionary not only for what it proclaims, but for the audacity of its act, announcing to the world that 13 colonies, long considered peripheral territories of an empire, were asserting sovereignty and self-determination. The war that followed was arduous and transformative. Battles at Saratoga, Yorktown, and throughout the colonies involved not only strategic brilliance, but profound human endurance. Continental forces faced logistical challenges, disease, and internal dissent, while British troops contended with unfamiliar terrain and extended supply lines. Yet alliances, particularly with France, provided critical support, reshaping the balance of power. French troops, supplies, and naval forces proved instrumental, demonstrating how global politics intersected with local revolutions. The revolution's impact extended far beyond the immediate military victories. It catalyzed social change, altered economic structures, and challenged existing hierarchies. Loyalists and patriots alike experienced displacement, loss, and redefinition of identity. The struggle prompted debates on slavery, women's roles, and governance, planting seeds for future reform movements. The war was as much about shaping a new society as it was about defeating a foreign power, making the American Revolution a profound experiment in self-determination and democratic governance. Even after the Treaty of Paris in 1783 formally ended hostilities, the work of nation-building began. States crafted constitutions, experimented with federalism, and debated. The aftermath of independence was far from idyllic. While the guns fell silent, the debates about the future roared on. How should 13 disparate colonies, each with its own economic interests, social structures, and regional identities, function as a unified nation? The Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781, represented the first attempt to formalize a collective government, but it quickly revealed its limitations. Central authority was weak, states retained significant autonomy, and the lack of federal taxation left the new nation financially vulnerable. Challenges were not merely theoretical, they affected everyday life. Soldiers who had risked their lives in the revolution faced delayed pay, unpaid pensions, and communities struggling under the weight of war debts. The economic landscape was complex. The colonies had relied heavily on trade with Britain, and the sudden severance created uncertainty and hardship. Merchants, farmers, and artisans had to navigate a new market, while inflation and scarcity made survival a daily challenge. Yet within these difficulties lay opportunity. Trade with other nations, particularly France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic, opened new avenues, reshaping commerce and industry in ways that would ultimately strengthen the fledgling nation. The revolution had been a catalyst, not merely for political change, but for economic reinvention. Socially, the revolution ignited a re-examination of rights and responsibilities. Discussions about the role of women, for instance, began to gain momentum. While women did not gain formal political power, figures like Abigail Adams famously reminded their husbands to remember the ladies when constructing new laws and government structures. Education, civic responsibility, and participation in local communities became points of focus. Women managed households, farms, and businesses in the absence of men who had gone to war, asserting a presence that would ripple through generations. Similarly, the institution of slavery faced increasing scrutiny. Northern states began gradual emancipation, driven both by moral arguments and practical considerations. In the South, however, slavery remained deeply entrenched, tied to economic systems and social hierarchies. The revolution's promise of liberty and equality created tensions that would simmer for decades, laying the groundwork for future conflict. The ideals articulated in the Declaration of Independence applied unevenly, revealing the complexities and contradictions inherent in forging a nation founded on freedom while sustaining practices that denied it to many. Meanwhile, veterans of the revolution navigated a new identity. They were no longer subjects of an empire, they were citizens of a republic. The camaraderie forged in battle and the shared experience of struggle contributed to a collective American consciousness. Symbols, rituals, and commemorations began to emerge, celebrating sacrifice and valor. Public memory in these early years became a tool to solidify unity, instill civic virtue, and transmit the revolutionary narrative to succeeding generations. Monuments were scarce, but stories, songs, and oral traditions carried the spirit of the revolution into homes, taverns, and classrooms. The efforts of governance prompted bold experimentation. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 convened to address the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Delegates wrestled with profound questions. How much power should reside in a central government versus individual states? How could representation be balanced among large and small states? What mechanisms would prevent tyranny while ensuring effective governance? These debates were often contentious, reflecting the diversity of interests and philosophies within the revolutionary leadership. Compromises, such as the Great Compromise, which created a bicameral legislature, and the Three-Fifths Compromise, which sought to reconcile representation with the existence of slavery, were pragmatic solutions to deeply entrenched divisions. Ratification of the Constitution in 1788 did not end controversy. Federalists, who supported a strong central government, clashed with anti-federalists, who feared concentrated power and potential erosion of individual liberties. The promise of a Bill of Rights, enshrining freedoms of speech, assembly, and religion, helped secure consensus and demonstrated a commitment to principles that had animated the revolution. These debates were not abstract. They shaped the very character of American democracy and reflected the ongoing struggle to align governance with the ideals that had inspired rebellion. Internationally, the American Revolution resonated far beyond the continent. European powers watched with keen interest, weighing alliances, trade opportunities, and ideological implications. France, still reeling from its own financial crises, invested heavily in the American cause, seeing both strategic advantage and alignment with Enlightenment principles. Spain and the Dutch Republic, too, engaged diplomatically and militarily, signaling that revolutions were never solely domestic affairs. The success of the American colonies provided a model and a warning to rulers and citizens alike. Popular uprisings could succeed, and new forms of governance were conceivable. The revolution also reshaped military thinking. The American forces, initially inexperienced and unevenly trained, relied on adaptability, intelligence networks, and unconventional tactics. Guerrilla warfare, surprise attacks, and local knowledge of terrain offset the formal training and equipment advantages of British troops. Leadership, most notably that of George Washington, emphasized endurance, morale, and strategic patience. Washington's personal example, his discipline, vision, and willingness to endure hardship alongside his soldiers, became legendary, providing a model for military and civic leadership alike. Yet the human cost of the revolution was immense. Casualties from battle, disease, and harsh conditions numbered in the tens of thousands. Communities were disrupted, families divided, and economies strained. Loyalists, who had maintained allegiance to Britain, often faced persecution, confiscation of property, and exile. Indigenous peoples, whose lands were caught in the crossfire, endured displacement and loss. The revolution was not a clean victory. It was a transformative upheaval, affecting every layer of society and leaving legacies of both progress and unresolved tension. Despite these challenges, the revolutionary period fostered remarkable innovation and cultural growth. Newspapers flourished, spreading political ideas and fostering public debate. Pamphlets, essays, and books circulated widely, creating an informed citizenry and shaping public opinion. Art, music, and literature reflected the aspirations and anxieties of a people in transition. Civic rituals, from town meetings to public commemorations, reinforced a sense of shared purpose and identity. In many ways, the revolution was as much a cultural movement as it was a military and political one, redefining how communities understood authority, citizenship, and responsibility. Leadership during the early republic required extraordinary vision. Figures like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Alexander Hamilton navigated uncharted political terrain. Their correspondence, writings, and policies reflect a blend of pragmatism and idealism, a recognition that freedom must be institutionalized through law, education, and civic engagement. They understood that independence was not merely a state of being, but a process of governance, requiring constant negotiation, compromise, and innovation. The economy gradually stabilized, aided by trade networks, infrastructure development, and the creation of a national currency. Banking systems, taxation policies, and commercial regulations evolved to support both domestic growth and international engagement. States experimented with economic models, from agrarian-based systems to early industrial ventures, reflecting the diversity of regional needs and resources. These developments laid the foundation for the United States' emergence as a dynamic and resilient economy. Socially, the revolutionary ideals began to influence debates on rights and inclusion. Abolitionist movements gained momentum in the North, advocating for the end of slavery and the recognition of basic human rights. Women's education became more prominent, reflecting the belief that an informed female citizenry was essential for the cultivation of virtuous families and communities. Indigenous communities, however, faced continued encroachment and marginalization, highlighting the contradictions and limits of revolutionary principles when applied unevenly. The global significance of the American Revolution cannot be overstated. It inspired subsequent revolutions from France to Latin America, demonstrating that popular movements could successfully challenge entrenched authority. The rhetoric of liberty, equality, and self-determination resonated across oceans and generations, influencing constitutions, legal systems, and political philosophies worldwide. The revolutionaries' emphasis on rights and representative governance became a template, a proof of concept, and a challenge to traditional hierarchies that extended far beyond the American continent. By the 1790s, the United States was navigating the complexities of a functioning republic. Political factions emerged, reflecting differing visions for the nation's future. Federalists advocated for a strong central government, economic modernization, and close ties with Britain, while Democratic Republicans emphasized states' rights, agrarian values, and support for France. These debates, often contentious, were indicative of a healthy, albeit turbulent democracy, a system designed to balance competing interests while remaining true to foundational ideals. The revolution's cultural and ideological legacy endured as well. Public education, civic participation, and the press became pillars of American identity. Symbols such as the American flag, national holidays, and historical commemorations reinforced collective memory. Revolutionary narratives emphasized heroism, sacrifice, and moral purpose, instilling a sense of national pride and continuity. Yet these narratives were not monolithic. They were contested, debated, and The establishment of the new government under the Constitution marked a turning point in the American experiment. George Washington's election as the first president in 1789 carried both symbolic and practical significance. As a figure of immense respect, he embodied the revolutionary ideals while providing the stability necessary for a fragile nation. Washington's leadership set precedents that would influence the office for centuries, from the peaceful transfer of power to the emphasis on national unity over partisan division. His presence reassured citizens that their hard-fought independence had matured into functional governance. Washington faced enormous challenges from the outset. The young republic was burdened with debt, faced threats from foreign powers, and was still defining the balance between federal and state authority. His administration had to establish institutions, codify laws, and navigate contentious debates among a population deeply invested in the principles of liberty. Alexander Hamilton, serving as the first Secretary of the Treasury, implemented bold financial policies, including federal assumption of state debts, creation of a national bank, and mechanisms to stabilize the currency. These measures provoked intense debate, but ultimately strengthened the nation's economic foundation. Meanwhile, Thomas Jefferson, as Secretary of State, championed agrarian values, emphasizing local governance and the autonomy of individual states. The ideological divide between Hamilton and Jefferson laid the groundwork for the first political parties in the United States, a reflection of the inherent tension between centralized authority and local self-determination. These debates were not abstract. They shaped policies, alliances, and even the everyday lives of ordinary citizens, demonstrating how the revolution's principles continued to evolve in practice. The social fabric of the new nation continued to transform in the 1790s. Communities adjusted to post-war realities, veterans reintegrated into civilian life, and a sense of national identity slowly emerged. Education and civic engagement were emphasized as essential for sustaining Republican ideals. Schools began to promote literacy not merely for personal advancement, but as preparation for responsible citizenship. Newspapers proliferated, facilitating informed discourse and public debate, a hallmark of the democratic experiment that the revolution had initiated. Despite these advancements, challenges remained. Native American tribes faced increasing pressure as settlers moved westward, often in violation of treaties. Conflicts arose along the frontier, exposing the contradictions between revolutionary ideals of liberty and the expansionist impulses of a growing nation. Enslaved people continued to endure oppression even as northern states moved toward gradual emancipation. The tension between freedom and inequality persisted, highlighting the complexity of translating revolutionary principles into a fully realized society. Internationally, the young United States navigated a turbulent geopolitical landscape. The French Revolution, beginning in 1789, initially inspired Americans, who saw parallels between France's struggle and their own. However, the radicalization of the French Revolution, coupled with European conflicts, posed diplomatic and strategic challenges. The United States pursued a policy of cautious neutrality under Washington's leadership, recognizing that survival depended on avoiding entanglement in European wars while asserting sovereignty. The Neutrality Proclamation of 1793 exemplified this pragmatic approach, balancing ideals with necessity. Trade, commerce, and foreign relations became critical arenas for demonstrating the nation's independence. Treaties with Britain, Spain, and other powers sought to secure borders, navigate maritime rights, and promote economic stability. The Jay Treaty with Britain in 1794, although controversial, exemplified the delicate diplomacy required to protect the fledgling republic's interests. Americans recognized that military victory alone did not guarantee security. Sustained independence required skillful negotiation, economic development, and internal cohesion. Cultural life continued to evolve alongside political institutions. Revolutionary ideals influenced literature, music, and art, shaping a distinct American identity. Patriotic songs, commemorative events, and symbols such as flags and monuments reinforced shared narratives of struggle, sacrifice, and triumph. Communities celebrated both local and national heroes, transmitting collective memory and instilling civic pride. These cultural expressions were as vital as laws and treaties in sustaining the revolutionary spirit. The expansion of settlement and commerce created new opportunities and challenges. Transportation networks, including roads, canals, and early industrial ventures, facilitated economic growth while connecting distant communities. Agricultural production intensified and commercial enterprises flourished, reflecting both continuity with colonial practices and innovation spurred by independence. The revolution had transformed the possibilities for social mobility, entrepreneurship, and civic participation, creating a dynamic environment in which citizens could shape their destinies. Legal frameworks evolved to support the new society. Courts, legislatures, and local governments interpreted and enforced laws that reflected revolutionary principles while accommodating practical realities. Property rights, contract law, and civil liberties were codified, providing stability and predictability in a society still recovering from war. These legal developments were essential for fostering economic growth, social cohesion, and public confidence in the new government. The period also witnessed debates about the nature of citizenship and participation. Who qualified as a citizen? What rights and responsibilities accompanied that status? Revolutionary rhetoric emphasized universal principles, yet implementation often excluded women, indigenous peoples, and enslaved individuals. These contradictions sparked ongoing dialogue and activism, shaping the trajectory of civil rights struggles that would continue for centuries. The revolution had set ideals into motion, but their full realization required continuous effort and advocacy. Military organization remained a priority even after the cessation of hostilities. While the Continental Army had disbanded, the need for a standing military to defend borders and maintain order was evident. Militia systems, fortifications, and training programs were established, reflecting the understanding that freedom required vigilance and the capacity for defense. This balance between civil authority and military necessity was a recurring theme in the early republic, echoing concerns that had animated revolutionary debates. The Northwest Territory became a focal point for expansion, settlement, and negotiation with indigenous peoples. Land policies sought to distribute territory to veterans and settlers, but they often conflicted with existing Native American claims. Treaties were negotiated, sometimes in good faith, often under duress, illustrating the complexities and moral ambiguities of nation-building. The revolution had freed Americans from colonial rule, but it also created new ethical dilemmas in the pursuit of national growth and security. Political institutions matured through trial and debate. Congressional procedures, judicial authority, and executive responsibilities were tested as the young nation confronted internal dissent, economic challenges, and foreign pressures. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, in which farmers in western Pennsylvania resisted taxation, demonstrated the practical challenges of enforcing federal authority. Washington's decision to mobilize militia forces to quell the rebellion underscored the delicate balance between liberty and law, illustrating that revolutionary ideals required careful stewardship to endure. Civic culture was increasingly participatory. Town meetings, local elections, and public forums became venues for debate and decision-making. Citizens engaged actively with issues ranging from taxation to infrastructure, reflecting the enduring influence of revolutionary ideals on public consciousness. Education and literacy were promoted not merely as personal enrichment, but as tools for informed citizenship, reinforcing the notion that freedom entailed responsibility. The revolution's influence extended beyond national borders. Latin American independence movements drew inspiration from the American example, as did reformers in Europe, seeking constitutional government and civil liberties. The American experience demonstrated that change was possible, even against formidable empires, providing both a model and a source of hope for oppressed peoples. Revolutionary rhetoric became a language of liberation, resonating in courts, assemblies, and pamphlets far from the original 13 colonies. Social change continued to unfold within the United States. Northern states moved steadily toward abolition, establishing legal frameworks for emancipation and integrating freed individuals into civic life. Debates over suffrage, education, and political participation reflected evolving ideals about equality and justice. Women, while still excluded from formal political power, exerted influence through education, civic organizations, and advocacy, shaping communities and nurturing the principles of the revolution in domestic and public spheres. Scientific inquiry, innovation, and cultural production also flourished. Observatories, universities, and learned societies emerged, promoting research and intellectual exchange. Newspapers, pamphlets, and books disseminated knowledge and ideas, fostering a literate and informed populace. The revolution had not only redefined governance, but also stimulated intellectual life, creating an environment in which curiosity, debate, and experimentation could thrive. The international context remained complex. Britain, while formally recognizing American independence, retained influence through trade and diplomacy. France, having incurred massive debts supporting the revolutionaries, faced its own domestic turmoil, influencing American calculations. Spain and other powers navigated shifting alliances, demonstrating that the consequences of the American Revolution were inseparable from global politics. American leaders had to manage these relationships carefully, balancing ideals of sovereignty with pragmatic considerations of security and economic growth. As the United States entered the 19th century, the nation faced the challenge of transforming revolutionary ideals into enduring structures of governance and civic life. The successes of the 1780s and 1790s had created institutions, but sustaining them required constant negotiation, compromise, and adaptation. Political factions, once focused on immediate post-war issues, began to develop more coherent platforms, reflecting the diverse visions of the nation's future. The Federalists emphasized strong central authority, economic modernization, and international engagement, while the Democratic Republicans championed agrarian values, states' rights, and a cautious approach to foreign entanglements. These ideological divisions were not mere abstractions. They shaped policies, elections, and the lived experiences of citizens across the young republic. The presidency of Thomas Jefferson, beginning in 1801, marked a significant evolution in governance. Jefferson's administration emphasized Republican simplicity, limited government, and expansionist vision. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, acquired from France, nearly doubled the nation's territory and opened vast tracts of land for settlement, agriculture, and commerce. This acquisition was not without controversy, challenging traditional interpretations of constitutional authority. Yet it exemplified the dynamic nature of the new government, demonstrating flexibility, strategic vision, and a willingness to seize opportunity in the service of national growth. As settlers moved westward, the nation faced new social and political challenges. Indigenous communities were increasingly displaced, treaties were negotiated and often violated, and frontier life required adaptation to unfamiliar environments. The expansion brought both opportunity and tension, testing the young republic's commitment to the principles articulated during the Revolution. Settlers, veterans, and new immigrants grappled with questions of land ownership, governance, and coexistence, creating a complex social tapestry that reflected both the promise and contradictions of revolutionary ideals. Internationally, the United States navigated a world still dominated by European powers. The Napoleonic Wars in Europe created both opportunities and threats for American trade and security. The Embargo Act of 1807, designed to protect American interests by limiting trade with warring nations, had mixed results. While it demonstrated the federal government's capacity to assert economic policy, it also generated domestic discontent and hardship. These challenges highlighted the delicate balance between maintaining sovereignty, supporting commerce, and preserving internal stability, a balance that revolutionary leaders had anticipated but could not fully predict. The War of 1812 further tested the nation's resilience. Conflict with Britain, sparked by maritime disputes, impressment of American sailors, and territorial ambitions, rekindled the revolutionary spirit. Battles along the Canadian border, naval engagements on the Great Lakes, and the defense of cities such as Baltimore and New Orleans demonstrated both the vulnerability and determination of the young republic. While the war ended in a stalemate with the Treaty of Ghent in 1814, it reinforced national identity, fostered pride, and demonstrated that the principles fought for during the Revolution were worth defending even a generation later. Economic transformation accelerated during this period. The market revolution reshaped production, trade, and labor, creating new opportunities and challenges. Factories, mechanized mills, and expanding transportation networks connected regions, facilitated commerce, and altered social structures. Urban centers grew, creating vibrant hubs of culture, politics, and innovation. At the same time, economic change exposed inequalities, labor tensions, and regional disparities, revealing that the revolution's promise of prosperity required ongoing negotiation and adaptation. Social reform movements emerged alongside economic and political changes. Abolitionist efforts gained momentum, driven by moral conviction, religious activism, and the example of revolutionary ideals. Women's education advanced, and public discourse increasingly included questions of equity, justice, and civic responsibility. These movements reflected the enduring influence of revolutionary principles. Liberty and equality were not static achievements, but ongoing aspirations that required vigilance, advocacy, and action. Culturally, the nation continued to develop a distinct identity. Literature, music, and the visual arts reflected both local experience and broader philosophical currents. Newspapers and pamphlets flourished, fostering debate, spreading ideas, and shaping public opinion. Civic rituals, including celebrations of Independence Day, commemorations of battles, and public honors for revolutionary figures, reinforced collective memory and transmitted values to new generations. Education became a central pillar, promoting literacy, civic understanding, and national cohesion. The institution of slavery, however, remained a profound contradiction. While northern states pursued gradual emancipation, southern economies remained deeply dependent on enslaved labor. The Revolution's ideals of liberty and equality were thus applied unevenly, creating moral and political tensions that would continue to challenge the nation. Abolitionist voices grew louder, drawing on revolutionary rhetoric to highlight the inconsistency between professed values and practiced oppression. These debates illustrated the limits of revolutionary change and the work still required to achieve its full promise. Westward expansion intensified these contradictions. Settlers seeking land and opportunity displaced indigenous populations and reconfigured regional power dynamics. Treaties, purchases, and conflicts reshaped the continent, often at the expense of those who had long inhabited it. The government's role in managing this expansion, balancing the rights of settlers with obligations to native nations, tested the principles of justice, fairness, and governance articulated during the Revolution. The evolution of political institutions reflected both continuity and change. Presidential elections became increasingly contested, party structures more formalized, and public engagement more widespread. Citizens debated not only policy, but also the nature of representation, federal authority, and the relationship between government and individual rights. These debates were a continuation of revolutionary engagement, demonstrating that self-governance was an ongoing, participatory process rather than a static achievement. The Monroe Doctrine, articulated in 1823, exemplified the new nation's emerging international posture. It asserted opposition to European colonial expansion in the Americas, signaling both confidence and responsibility. While largely a statement of principle at first, it reflected the United States' growing awareness of its role in hemispheric politics and its commitment to protecting the sovereignty that had been won through revolution. Culturally, the nation experienced a flourishing of identity and creativity. Writers, artists, and thinkers explored themes of freedom, individualism, and national destiny. Civic ceremonies, monuments, and historical narratives reinforced shared memory and conveyed the significance to citizens. Education expanded, promoting civic literacy and instilling a sense of responsibility rooted in revolutionary ideals. Communities celebrated achievements, commemorated sacrifices, and transmitted values, ensuring that the lessons of independence remained vibrant. Economic innovation continued apace. The development of canals, roads, and later railroads transformed transportation, commerce, and settlement patterns. Agriculture became more efficient, trade expanded, and industry gradually increased in importance. These changes reshaped social structures, creating new classes of entrepreneurs, laborers, and professionals. Revolutionary ideals of self-determination, opportunity, and civic participation found new expression in these economic transformations, linking political freedom with material advancement. Throughout these decades, the Revolution's legacy persisted in both ideology and practice. Political debates, legal reforms, and social movements drew on revolutionary principles to address contemporary challenges. Citizens, inspired by the experiences of their forebears, engaged actively in shaping their communities, advocating for rights, and participating in governance. The revolutionary period had set the stage, but the ongoing work of defining and implementing freedom was now in the hands of a new generation. Internationally, the United States began to assert itself more confidently. Diplomatic engagement, trade agreements, and strategic alliances reflected both the practical necessities of survival and the ideological commitments to sovereignty and self-determination. The revolution had demonstrated that ordinary people could challenge empire. Now, the nation navigated a complex global environment, leveraging the lessons of independence to secure its interests while projecting its principles abroad. Socially, reform movements gained visibility and influence. Abolitionists, educators, and advocates for women's participation in public life drew inspiration from revolutionary rhetoric. Communities experimented with civic organizations, local governance structures, and public forums, fostering engagement and responsibility. These developments underscored the enduring significance of revolutionary ideals. Liberty, equality, and civic participation were not abstract concepts, but active, evolving commitments requiring vigilance, debate, and action. The War of 1812, westward expansion, and economic transformation collectively shaped the nation's character. Citizens experienced both the challenges and opportunities of independence, learning that freedom was inseparable from responsibility. Civic culture, rooted in revolutionary experience, emphasized education, engagement, and accountability, creating a foundation for the democratic practices that would define the United States in the coming centuries. By the mid-19th century, the United States had become a more complex, interconnected society. Transportation networks linked distant regions, commerce expanded, and communities diversified. The revolutionary ideals of self-governance, civic responsibility, and individual rights continued. As the United States progressed into the 19th century, the long-term consequences of the American Revolution became increasingly apparent. The ideals fought for on battlefields and articulated in founding documents continued to resonate, influencing generations and shaping the trajectory of the nation. Political institutions, though tested repeatedly, became more resilient. demonstrating that the principles of self-governance could endure even amid disagreement, hardship, and social change. Citizens participated actively in local and national affairs, reinforcing the notion that democracy required vigilance, engagement, and a commitment to shared values. The legacy of the revolution extended far beyond governance. Education, commerce, civic engagement, and cultural life were all imbued with the principles of liberty and responsibility. Communities organized schools, public forums, and local governments, creating a participatory civic culture. Newspapers and pamphlets proliferated, spreading ideas and fostering debate across regions. Art, literature, and music reflected both local experience and broader philosophical currents, emphasizing individual expression, collective memory, and the ideals of freedom and justice. The legacy of the revolution extended far beyond governance. Education, commerce, civic engagement, and cultural life were all imbued with the principles of liberty and responsibility. Communities organized schools, public forums, and local governments, creating a participatory civic culture. Newspapers and pamphlets proliferated, spreading ideas and fostering debate across regions. Art, literature, and music reflected both local experience and broader philosophical currents, emphasizing individual expression, collective memory, and the ideals of freedom and justice. The revolution, therefore, was not only a military and political achievement, but a profound cultural transformation. Social tensions persisted, however, reflecting the complexities of translating revolutionary ideals into practice. The institution of slavery remained a deep contradiction, challenging the nation to reconcile its commitment to liberty with entrenched economic and social systems. Indigenous peoples faced displacement, loss of sovereignty, and cultural disruption as westward expansion intensified. Women, though increasingly influential in education, civic life, and reform movements, remained largely excluded from formal political power. These contradictions highlighted the ongoing struggle to fully realize the promises of the revolution, revealing that freedom and equality were aspirational goals requiring sustained effort. The expansion of the nation's territory, through both settlement and negotiation, brought both opportunity and ethical challenges. The Louisiana Purchase, the annexation of territories, and the movement of settlers into previously indigenous lands required careful governance and strategic vision. These developments illustrated the dynamic tension between revolutionary ideals of self-determination and the realities of power, economic necessity, and human ambition. The revolution's legacy was thus both inspirational and cautionary, offering principles to guide action while demanding ethical vigilance. Economic transformation continued to reshape American life. The Industrial Revolution gradually took hold, introducing mechanized production, urbanization, and new labor dynamics. Markets expanded, trade networks deepened, and entrepreneurship flourished. These changes created opportunities for wealth, mobility, and innovation, while also exposing inequalities and social tensions. Revolutionary principles were invoked in debates over economic policy, labor rights, and social responsibility, demonstrating that the struggle for liberty extended into the realms of commerce and daily life. Cultural identity evolved alongside political and economic development. National symbols, public commemorations, and historical narratives reinforced a shared sense of purpose and continuity. Independence Day celebrations, monuments to revolutionary figures, and the preservation of battle sites conveyed collective memory and civic pride. Literature and education emphasized the principles of the revolution, transmitting values to new generations and creating a citizenry capable of self-governance. The revolution thus shaped both institutions and the imagination, embedding ideals into the social and cultural fabric of the nation. Internationally, the United States continued to assert its sovereignty and influence. Diplomacy, trade, and strategic alliances reflected both pragmatic considerations and ideological commitments. The Monroe Doctrine, for example, declared the Western Hemisphere off-limits to further European colonization, asserting the nation's independence and shaping its role in hemispheric politics. Revolutionary ideals inform these policies, emphasizing sovereignty, self-determination, and the protection of liberty against external domination. Political institutions matured through ongoing engagement and reform. Congressional procedures, judicial interpretation, and executive authority were tested repeatedly, demonstrating both the resilience and adaptability of the republican system. Citizens engaged in elections, civic debates, and advocacy, shaping policies and challenging leadership when necessary. The revolution had established the principles. The succeeding generations were responsible for their practical application, ensuring that governance remained accountable, participatory, and aligned with foundational ideals. The influence of the revolution on social reform was profound. Abolitionist movements, women's advocacy, and educational initiatives drew upon revolutionary rhetoric to argue for equality, justice, and inclusion. Activists emphasized that the principles of liberty, articulated in 1776, were universal and should extend to all members of society. These movements, though encountering resistance and setbacks, gradually reshaped public consciousness, laying the groundwork for future legal and social advances. The revolution's impact extended into legal frameworks. Constitutions, statutes, and judicial decisions reflected an ongoing negotiation between ideal and practice. Property rights, civil liberties, and representative governance were codified, providing structure while allowing flexibility to address evolving societal needs. Courts interpreted laws with reference to revolutionary principles, ensuring that the nation's founding ideals remained active in shaping policy and resolving disputes. Civic life was enriched by the enduring emphasis on participation. Town meetings, public forums, and educational initiatives fostered engagement and debate. Citizens were not passive recipients of government. They were active participants in shaping policies, advocating for reforms, and maintaining accountability. This participatory culture reflected the revolution's central lesson: freedom was inseparable from responsibility, requiring active, informed, and continuous engagement. The revolution also left a lasting imprint on military and strategy thinking. The experience of mobilizing militias, coordinating logistics across vast distances, and sustaining morale under challenging conditions provided enduring lessons. Military institutions were reorganized and professionalized, ensuring that the nation could defend its sovereignty while upholding the principles it had fought to establish. These lessons informed both domestic security and international policy, embedding the revolutionary experience into strategic planning and policy. Education emerged as a crucial pillar of the new society. Schools and universities emphasized literacy, civic understanding, and moral instruction, preparing citizens to participate effectively in governance and society. Revolutionary ideals were taught not only as history, but as living principles, informing debates, shaping character, and fostering a culture of responsibility. Knowledge, public discourse, and civic engagement became intertwined, ensuring that the revolution's lessons continued to resonate across generations. As the nation expanded and diversified, regional differences became more pronounced. Economic, social, and political variations reflected historical development, resource distribution, and cultural traditions. Yet despite these differences, the revolution provided a unifying narrative and framework. Shared history, collective memory, and national symbols reinforced cohesion, allowing the United States to navigate diversity while maintaining a sense of common purpose. The American Revolution's legacy extended beyond national borders. Its ideals inspired independence movements in Latin America, influenced constitutional thought in Europe, and provided a model for democratic experimentation worldwide. The struggle demonstrated that ordinary people could challenge entrenched power, articulate universal principles, and construct institutions to sustain freedom. Its message resonated across continents, offering both inspiration and a practical template for reform and self-determination. By the mid-19th century, the United States had established a resilient framework for governance, social engagement, and cultural identity. Revolutionary ideals continue to shape law, policy, education, and public discourse. Citizens remained responsible for sustaining freedom, applying principles to new challenges, and ensuring that governance reflected both justice and practicality. The revolution's lessons were enduring, Liberty required vigilance, equality required advocacy, and democracy required participation. The narrative of the American Revolution is thus not confined to a sequence of battles, declarations, and treaties. It is a story of ideas, courage, and collective effort. It is the story of ordinary individuals confronting extraordinary circumstances, of leaders balancing vision with pragmatism, and of a society continuously negotiating the meaning of freedom. Its lessons are timeless. The pursuit of liberty, justice, and